I'm really pleased to be joined now by Ashley Scotland of Thriving Survivors. At some point, Ashley and I are going to do a podcast episode as well, but it's really great to have you here today, Ashley, because there's a couple of subjects that you and I are going to dive into at some depth. But you head up Thriving Survivors. So why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and Thriving Survivors and the work that you do?
Thanks, Nancy. I'm delighted to be part of this, and I'm very much looking forward to our podcast. So I am Ashley Scotland. I'm the founder and chief executive of Thriving Survivors, an organisation that was established in 2016 to support survivors of trauma through a 4-stage recovery pathway. And I'll speak more to that as we sort of progress through our conversation today. My lived experience was what took me into developing the organisation and building something that really helped people to grow and to be able to face into their trauma and then experience growth beyond that. And that's where it really started, was with a post-traumatic growth programme. And then we've since built that into 4 stages end to end, where people can come in at a point of crisis and be supported right the way through to volunteering and employment opportunities. So we are a lived experience organisation, and everybody that works within the organisation in stage 1 is somebody with lived experience, and they've been through the pathway and have come back as staff themselves.
Well, and I think that's great too, because one of the themes, particularly in sibling sexual abuse that's coming up, is the importance of the lived experience the big buzzword is, of course, trauma informed and everything, and which is great. But so much has come out in terms of prevention and intervention with sibling sexual abuse, and not as much as could be out there in the world, because on one of the other content blocks of the Awareness Day, it's quite starkly noted that research is limited on sibling sexual abuse, for sure. But what is becoming something that is informing the whole conversation is lived experience. And I think when it comes also to interventions, hopeful interventions, and interventions that support people in their journey of recovery who've been impacted by trauma, generally, and SSA specifically, that lived experience piece is great, so that your program and your staff at some level are trauma informed, lived experience, I think, is super important. So thanks for sharing that piece. It brings a level of authenticity to the work that is very comforting and supportive to those who are survivors. So tell us briefly, though, a little bit about this 4-stage pathway that people go through.
So the 4-stage pathway was initially set up, and the organisation was built specifically on stage 3. The model itself it's got its foundations within Professor Judith Herman's 3-stage model of trauma and recovery. I myself had went through 2 of the 3 stages that were available with an organisation, and was supported through that. And then at the end, I realised there was no stage 3. There was no organisation that helped you to complete that 3-stage process. And I realised that I had actually, through my own recovery, built what I now call my toolkit, and I developed a toolkit into a group work program called the Discovering Me program, and it does exactly what it says on the tin. So stage 1 is very much about safety and stability, and getting a person to be able to live in the moment, and to be able to deal with the sort of core basic needs that they have. And we've got lived experience mentors who support people at this stage in the service, and they can help with a whole host of different needs, and things that might come up, emotions, practical things like being able to engage with other organisations such as the social housing landlords, or being able to engage with the Department of Works and Pensions, for example. So the lived experience mentors can help them sort of through that process. Stage 2 is about remembrance and mourning, and this is where we offer a therapeutic talking therapy space where people can be supported to go back and look at the child within, and sort of reclaim that process in that childhood. And then stage 3 is about finding meaning. And that's about you finding purpose and finding meaning within your experience. And that, I suppose, Thriving Survivors was my stage 3. And that was me building my own stage 3. And we've now sort of grown beyond that and created a 4th stage, which is living life with purpose. And this is where we offer volunteering and employment opportunities for people that have come through that pathway. We offer healing cafes, which is some of that restorative work that we do. And then we've got a suite of restorative services as well. But I think the sort of most important one, and this service will use all 4 stages of this model, is our family service, where we will take a whole family approach to healing harm. And everybody that's involved in that or participates within that would be offered access to that pathway individually before we would then look at any form of reunification. So yes, the pathway has developed somewhat, Nancy, since 2016, where it was one single service. We now offer so much, and that it really does take somebody from point A right the way through to that sort of growth destination.
Which I think is super important too, but also that added piece about involving the whole family and taking the family through now, because you know, with sibling sexual abuse in particular, all the evidence is pointing to a family approach when it comes to intervention. There's no doubt that survivor takes front stage, and that safety and work and everything is a top priority. And then though, the family also needs to be part of the solution, part of the opportunity for whole family healing. And it sounds like that's a big focus. I really like though how you said that with the stage 3 Thriving Survivors was your stage 3 on the pathway. But that whole concept of finding meaning and then subsequently finding purpose through employment and skills and things like that is a piece that I don't think people fully appreciate when it comes to their own healing, as it were, and the healing of their family. Says, how do we make meaning of something? Now, it doesn't mean everybody has to go out and make a nonprofit like you have, but what we are finding and what we know is that when people get to a certain point in their journey, they want to turn from within to without. They want to turn and make meaning of what happened to them by supporting others in one way or another. It could be in doing sort of the work that you're doing. It could be people who are writing a memoir and hoping that people will read that memoir and find solace in it. It could be people just sharing information of what's happened to them in their local community or just within their local circle, but they need to find that meaning. So I love that that's where you went with your need to find that meaning. So, but I think we're going to swing back to this a little bit when we're talking a little bit more about being resilient and post-traumatic growth. But one of the things that we want to look at first is something that your organization deals with and sort of supports and moves forward, is the concept of restorative justice and restorative practice when it comes to that reunification of the family or restoring the health of the family. So let's jump into that a little bit, okay? So for the audience in particular, but for me as well, because I don't know as much about this as you do, but what is restorative justice? It is a term that many people have heard, but I don't think they fully understand it. So what is restorative justice?
So restorative justice is a form of supported and facilitated communication between the party who was the person who was harmed and the person who caused harm. And that can take, that's in its traditional forum. That is what restorative justice is. It can take many different forums in terms of methods for delivering that. So you can have direct communication where we would bring the people into the space and it would be facilitated after many months of preparation. But we can also do shuttle dialogue where a facilitator would go between the two parties and take the conversation back and forward. We can do that through letter writing. So we can also have indirect contact where we can put different measures in place to make sure that everybody that would be within that space would be supported and would feel safe as part of that. So that's restorative justice in its traditional form. This is where, for me, I think the word justice, I think the restorative justice piece doesn't do the work any favors, because people automatically, when they hear the word justice, associate it to the criminal justice system. And in some countries, that is how restorative justice works. It is connected to the justice system. But here in Scotland, the process that we have developed is parallel to the justice system. So actually, it doesn't involve our justice system at all within our processes. Of course, we need to be aware of them, and we wouldn't be able to sort of step into a case if there was active criminal justice processes taking place. But in Scotland, we are attempting to have them both sitting very, very separately. So restorative justice should always be voluntary, and it should allow a space for people to be heard. And from any justice system, most justice systems across the world, when something happens, the people within the process lose their voice, and it becomes very much about process and procedure. So I think the word justice doesn't do the work any favours, and that's why the term restorative practices and restorative approaches is a much better way to look at it, because it's not in any way connected to the justice system. Restorative approaches can take many different forms. So you can host circles, you can have meetings, you can do indirect and direct contact. So it can take many, many different forms. Restorative practice, for me, is about how we interact and how we engage with people. And I think it should just be how we operate on a daily basis. It's just, we as an organisation want to become restorative, and it's not about having a restorative justice service. It's about, as an organisation, looking at how we address conflict. How do we deal with conflict within the organisation, and how do we then deal with that in a way that is restorative? So that whole restorative practice for me is about people and how we engage and how we interact, and I think that can be restorative in itself. Restorative approaches, again, I think can be woven into people's practice. Do you know, when actually, if we start to embed some of this into training, especially when we're looking at sibling sexual abuse, taking a restorative approach allows everybody to be heard within that, and not only to be heard, but to be held safely in a space where everybody can understand the harm, but can then also start to address that as well. So I think there is an issue and a need for reframing the term justice when we're talking about restorative practice.
I think you bring up a great point, because whenever I've thought about restorative justice in the past until sort of recently, it was always in the context of the criminal justice system. Usually somebody's in jail, and the family comes along, or the victim's family or whatever, and there's a restorative justice process that's been put in place. And one of the things that I find a little bit confusing about the term restorative justice in that context is, who's defining what justice is? And how then does that work? Like, as you say, it gets confounded with policies and procedures and practice when it's mandated in a justice system sort of thing. And that term justice gets lost, because for SSA survivors, for example, the term justice is different for every person. For some person, the justice that they want is an apology, sincere, real apology, and I suppose a bit of remorse, or something that demonstrates that somebody understands the harm that they've caused. That's sufficient justice. And so this move that you're talking about, that expanding the term into restorative practice or restorative approaches, I think takes that into consideration more so than just the term justice. But it is, I think, also important to remember that whatever we're doing in our interventions must be deemed to be justice for the survivor.
That's right.
So, but it doesn't have to be in the court system. And ideally, there's many instances of SSA in terms of the behaviors and all of these sorts of things that either won't ever get into the court system or shouldn't be in the court system. You know, and there's jurisdictions around the world that see SSA as more of a health issue, health-centric issue, rather than a criminal justice issue. And so if we're only relying on the justice system to provide restoration of something, then we're going to run into a lot of trouble. So this whole idea of expanding, you know, looking at what is our day-to-day restorative practice? Like, you know, you were saying in your workplace, you endeavor to make the workplace itself a place of restorative practice and taking that approach. And in other workplaces, any workplace, for example, in our communities, how can we on a daily basis just be in that restorative mindset? But there are certain sort of fundamental themes or ideas about restorative practice, like what sort of concepts fall into this idea of restorative practice? Are we always asking, oh, how are you doing? You know, like what, you know what I mean? And I don't mean to sound facetious, but is it always sort of almost therapeutic in its nature, or is there some other way that you would compartmentalize or demonstrate a restorative practice, for example?
So just having stepped into some of the delivery of restorative practice, and the referrals have come in for restorative justice, but actually there's a practice level first and a preparation level first. And that you can see impact of that right away, instant hope for people. Just actually being able to step into a family and to be able to go to them and to be able to say, actually, we can work with everybody here within this space, and to see an instant level of, it's almost like a weight being lifted, and it was visible and it was instant. And you know, they're just in being restorative in our approach in terms of how we hosted that initial conversation, offered hope to a family and people within that family. And you know, that's what the work's all about, Nancy, you know, to see that and to know how distant that is for so many people right now across the world. That hope, that hope's just not there. And I think to be able to step in and to be truly restorative in how you engage in conversation, how you approach, it's about letting somebody be heard, Nancy. It's about actually providing a space for validation, and to be heard in a non-judgmental way, so as that you can start to process. And the impact of that restorative practice, it's just incredible to see.
Can you give me a practical example? Just a simple one, nothing too intense or anything, but sort of conversation A is not restorative practice, conversation B is. Like, can you give me an example?
Well, Nancy, you've proper put me on
the spot.
One. Yes. So I think there's an example would be talking to someone, and putting your voice in the space, where actually you're sort of directing where that meeting would go, compared to being in a space and letting somebody actually guide where that goes, and allowing that voice. How you approach and how you hold the space is really key. And it is very much about the person who's sat in front of you, regardless of who they are within the particular situation. It's their space and it's their time to be held. And really it's about getting to know that person. Tell us about you. It's not about, it's about the impact that's had on them, and letting them sort of go in and what impact has this had on you. And I think that's really really key to sort of finding out and sort of leading those conversations.
Would it be sort of language like what often happens is somebody will make a comment and then someone will come back on their own experience of that. Oh, well, yeah, that happened to me, and then they'd go down that path. Or you would make a comment, say, as say a survivor of SSA, and someone would redirect away from where you're talking right now. That sort of that non-therapeutic, that non-supportive conversation is to lead away. And or to not so much questions can be quite good in that sort of context for sure, but it's also, I suppose, the tone, intonation of what it is that you're saying, how you're holding yourself as a person who's listening. I don't know how many conversations I've been in with people where they're sort of looking around, and not, I can tell they're not engaged with what I'm saying. And the reason why I'm sort of going down this path with you is I want to see if we can sort of demonstrate that this isn't a type of communication that happens only in a therapeutic space, but it can be something that people learn to do just in their own lives and in a way of being. And it's a mindset. And granted, life has timelines to it. You can't, even in the workplace, for example, because we were talking about that before, I can't sit there all day with somebody and listen as a manager, say, or as a HR person and just take this restorative practice to the whole day. That would be a little bit different. But there are, I know myself, because I'm trained in counseling psychology, I know there are ways to still be there in a timeline, because invariably for me, whenever I talk about these sorts of things, somebody will say to me, I don't have all the time in the world, and it's like, you don't have to have all the time in the world to practice something in the moment.
Yeah.
So again, just these examples of, and often when I myself am sort of trying to help people to learn how to listen and learn how to communicate, there is that idea that one can learn how to quiet one's own questions and judgments and everything. And just by being very present moment to what somebody's saying, that is restorative in and of itself. Because as you were saying, most people don't feel heard.
That's right. That's
right?
about in that space, and how you are in that space, so important. How you show up and how you present in that space will be key to the relationship between the people within it. And there is that level of authenticity, and there needs to be a level of confidence in you as the facilitator to be able to hold that space as well. So yeah, it's about how you show up and the way in which you see things, and the way in which you hear as well. You don't just listen, but you actually hear what the person's saying to you.
And you demonstrate, or whether it's through words or actions or demeanor, that you've heard somebody. Right. The reason why I'm harping on about this or going on about this right now is because restorative justice tends to be something that's facilitated within a structured justice environment, whereas restorative practice is something that we can do in the bigger world as an intervention to support people who have been impacted by SSA. And while it is still a process, there's still things to go through, it is not as labor intensive or long-winded as the restorative justice system can be. I mean, you can literally start a restorative justice process through the court system here in Canada in particular. And sort of maybe 18 months from now, you'll be sitting down with the person that you wish to speak to. So it's quite long and drawn out, where I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe an approach that is more what you're referring to can be facilitated faster.
And it's fluid as well, and it's consistent in how it's delivered and who it's delivered by. If you're waiting 18 months, the actual possibility of turnover in staff by that point, you could have 3 or 4 different people having to speak to you within that period of time. Whereas the way we are doing it at the moment, the referral comes in and right away there's an assessment done on that, and there's an initial an initial call put in, and at that point we take that from there, which cuts away all the sort of red tape and that sits around the justice system, which makes these things so much more difficult. So yeah, I think that it's much more fluid in terms of being able to respond to the person and their needs at that moment in time than your traditional justice system would be.
And I think also it plays back into that sense of hope as well. So it's not only in the communication, but the things around the communication, because, you know, I was actually just speaking to someone not associated with this event at all. And we were talking about, you know, what do people need when they're confused or when they're stuck somewhere, whether that's practically in a work environment, which is what I was in the context that I was talking with somebody about, or in sort of this environment of intervention and an approach to supporting somebody who's been impacted by SSA. You know, what do people need? They need to be heard, they need to be seen, but they need a path, or they need the hope of a path or a framework. Because and it's always been my experience when I manage people as an adult survivor of SSA, doing the work that I do with SiblingsToo, is that as soon as the path falls apart, people are more likely to feel confused, lost, and unsafe. So what we're talking about then is a form of intervention that provides that framework, and it just provides these steps so that people can see further down the line, right? They have, as you say, that sense of hope, and they can see that, oh, down there, I may feel better, or I may, you know, be able to feel more fulfilled in my life or whatever, if I sort of follow down this path and see where this goes. Am I interpreting that right?
Yeah, so I think that idea of when you step, if we're talking about still in the restorative justice piece, when you step into your process, we've got one case at the moment that's gone really quickly, and actually we expect to be done and the whole process to completed within 12 weeks. Whereas we've got another case that actually there's going to be a lot more work needs done, and actually we will need to take stages of preparation. And I think that's the key piece, is that preparation will be different for everybody. Some people know exactly what they're coming in with. So when you come in, actually, this, I want A, B, C, and D, and then we've got something to work with at that point. But then we've got other people that can come in and they don't really know, they're looking for justice, but I don't think they've quite defined that yet. So there's a process takes place there where we actually spend a bit of time working on that. So what is it we're actually looking for? But then you can also get people that come in and actually they're so in need of that recovery pathway, that sort of 3 stages of support where they can really look and start to address some of the trauma, but then also start to recover and grow beyond that. So I think the different processes and different approaches for each individual person that comes into it. But I think having a pathway and having a beacon of hope that you can see light at the end. I know it's that cheesy saying, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but I think one of the things I love about our organisation is you can look in and you can see you and reflected back at you. You can see somebody who has walked a similar path and who has gone through similar stuff. But you also see that person being strong and being resilient and actually being in a position to then support other people. So everybody needs a light at the end. You know, everybody needs that when you're in the height of darkness, which so many of us have been, and so many of us struggle to come out of. And that's what's needed. You need a beacon. You need something, a lighthouse that just continues to push its light, because that is what people will gravitate towards.
It is, and it's a very attractive idea, you know, when you have hope and there's that light, as you say, as cliche as the light at the end of the tunnel sounds. There's that idea of, I have got a way, a path, and that's why your program's got the word pathways in it. But you know, it's a way that I can be, because right now I'm just kind of all over the place sort of thing, right? So, but that segues really nicely into the other part of our conversation, which is all about the concept of post-traumatic growth and resilience. Again, both of us have real passions for this subject, so you know, we could talk forever about it. Try not to, but we could. But a lot of people will not know these terms or be only marginally familiar with them. So let's start with this idea of post-traumatic growth. What is that?
So post-traumatic growth is, for me, the process you go through after experiencing trauma, and it is about that transformation beyond your post-traumatic stress. So we know post-traumatic stress disorder, we hear it mentioned, we hear PTSD, we hear complex PTSD. We don't speak about post-traumatic growth often enough. It is transformational. And I think that's the key word within it, is even after everything that you can go through, to be able to come through the other side of that and to be a different person. I don't see myself as the same version as I was. I truly believe I have gone through a process of post-traumatic growth, and I might even sit further beyond that now. So I think there is a sort of continuum there, but for me, post-traumatic growth is about the personal transformational development that takes place after experiencing trauma.
And I think it's really important we talk about this as a thing, because yes, people are familiar with PTSD and complex PTSD, and that's all they hear about. So where is the hope in that language? There's not a lot. It's like, I have PTSD. Okay. Like, great. That's lovely to say I have that. Now what? So even sharing with people the possibilities of growth, you know, you kind of intuitively know it, and there's old sayings of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and you know, again, more cliche stuff. But really, for people particularly who are sort of now adult survivors of SSA, this idea that there is a path you can go down, and that path helps you to grow, and that path gets you to a different place than you're in now, I think is an important message, as you say. We don't say it often enough. We don't let people know that this concept exists, and it's not just some theoretical thing. My master's degree is in positive psychology, so it's all about this sort of stuff. And how do we get there from a growth perspective? And the idea of growth from trauma is people, they do sort of rail against it a little bit, you know, and I've been in Facebook groups and stuff like that, and people don't want to hear about this idea of, well, I could be stronger, I could be a quote unquote better person or whatever. I don't really care about that. And I understand that, but I keep putting the message out there because I want people to know that when you're ready to step onto that path, there is actually one that takes you away from the conversations that are all about trauma and PTSD and all of these, you know, other really significant and negative impacts that SSA can have. I wouldn't say that post-traumatic growth is a positive impact of trauma at all. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't phrase it that way, but it is a possibility after trauma has occurred or has repeatedly occurred, however you want to look at it. So, but
Yeah.
so how does one grow?
Uh, uh,
How long is a piece of string?
oh, so I think there's a forgiveness piece in there, for all the guilt and shame that you carry as a survivor, as a person who is affected by sibling sexual abuse, because it's much wider than just the survivor. But I think that instant step of being able to look in and forgive oneself for everything that you sort of put yourself through. And then there's the level of self-awareness that needs to develop within, you know, being able to look at yourself and go, do you know, I never did that very well. How How do I now move forward, learn from what happened there, and actually use that to make sure that I don't step into a similar situation. Knowing when you're going to slip and fall, like being able to stop that is just wonderful. Being able to, when you're triggered, you have a flashback, because let's be really honest, the trauma lives with you forever. It doesn't matter how much you grow and how much post-traumatic growth you go through, that trauma will always be there. It'll always be existent, especially within this sibling context. It is lifelong. So that ability to recognize that and to be, I think, okay with that as well. I think there's a level of acceptance that needs to come, and that, okay, this was the situation, but it isn't now. So how do we now move it from here to here? Your mindset, how you approach things, how you look at things, there's so much in it. Your emotional regulation, the ability to say, do you know what, I feel really, really angry today, and I don't know where that's coming from. See, being able to pick that apart and recognize that your anger needs to be transitioned into something else. One of the reasons I'm so passionate is because I've used the anger that sat within me and transformed it into something that just grew and blossomed. And yeah, Nancy, I could speak about this stuff.
I know, which is great. It's fantastic because you're a living example, as I think I am too, of the path that you can go down. And I've been on the path for quite a long time myself, and done a lot of work. And you're right, I'm in my 60s now, and I still get flashbacks and stuff. And it's like, oh, look, there's a flashback. Moving on, that's how it impacts me now, is that acceptance piece, the forgiveness piece in particular. I think self-compassion is another phrase I would say when it comes to post-traumatic growth. But one of the ways that I think is really important, and it fits in with the self-awareness piece, is being very aware of how you talk to yourself, what you're saying to yourself. One of the words that I use with my clients in relation to just not necessarily survivors of SSH, but just my clients, is how often do you should on yourself? And I do say that word very carefully, because I can slip up on it. But the research, I did some research when I was doing my degree on narrative psychology. It's one of the things that I love, and how the words we use impact our day, impact this moment, impact this day, impact our lives and how we see each other. One of the words that we in the English-speaking world use a lot is the word should. Well, should, if you look it up, is all about societal norms. It has nothing to do with personal power. And one needs a degree of personal power to get to that post-traumatic growth. Like that, personal power and post-traumatic growth to me sort of go together, because as you're growing, you're taking command of yourself. You're demonstrating your power. And those who use the word should a lot don't really have a lot of power, but should is a word, if you just look around, and I'm sure I've already said it in this conversation a few times, but if you look around, we say the word should an awful lot. I should be able to do this better. I should recover from this faster. I should be able to get my job done better. I should phone my mother more often. I should take the dog for a walk more because the poor thing crosses his legs. As innocuous as that seems, every time we say the word should, we're actually stimulating parts of our brain related to fear and anxiety. And then you mix in either being the survivor of or the perpetrator of sibling sexual abuse. The shoulds that come out of that: I should have stopped it. They should have known. He shouldn't have done what he did, or she shouldn't have done what she did. All of this sorts of language just sucks us down. And I think one of the parts of growth is to learn what language we use and minimize the use of that language. Now, I still use the word should, and I should on other people, and I definitely should on my husband about what he should and shouldn't be doing, and all this sort of stuff. But I know in my own journey of growth, this idea of really taking charge of how I talk to myself And minimizing those things that do not serve me, such as the word should, has really propelled me along that path of growth. Because in the work that I do, but just generally speaking, I sort of envision it like a champagne bottle, a really good champagne bottle. So the cork is there, and the cork is things like anxiety and fear and misinformation and fake news and these sorts of things that are going on in your head. And what happens when you pop that cork and all that luscious champagne comes bubbling out, as cliche as this is going to sound? All of that is my personal power. All of that champagne is my personal growth and the possibilities I can create in my life. But when fear and anxiety and shoulds and hate and rage, not just anger and all that's fine. These are important emotions that we have all our lives, and that's fine. But when we're turning it into things like rage, that's a little bit different. All those things keep that cork in the bottle. So for me, post-traumatic growth is popping that cork and moving on from that and letting all that good stuff go. I fundamentally believe that humans are naturally intelligent. I fundamentally believe that humans are also naturally warm and compassionate. But we tend to lose sight of that, especially to ourselves. So for me, part of post-traumatic growth is really what you were saying, that forgiveness of self. And when you were saying it, that's where the should came up in my head, because we're usually forgiving ourselves for things we think we should have done. Now, if we remove the word should, we don't need to forgive ourselves because the premise is gone. But still, there is some self-forgiveness, I think, in most of our life experiences is we've done things that, or been involved in things that, whatever. But that self-awareness piece, all about the self, is so important when it comes to growth. To me, PTSD is kind of happens to you. It's this result of stuff that happens to you. Post-traumatic growth is something you can create yourself. Do you know what I mean? So it's just switching the perspective a little bit. Again, I could chat about this forever. So what are your thoughts on anything I've said?
No, I think you're bang on the money in terms of how we speak to ourselves. I don't use the word try because there's no conviction in it. I'll try to lose some weight. I'll try and pick that up this evening. I'll try and meet you next week. I do not use the word moving the language that does restrict us. And language, well, that's a whole other podcast and a whole other conversation. Fancy over there. How we speak to ourselves and that act of kindness and actually being able to just sit and to be still and to not feel guilt for that and to actually just be able to rest, because that natural instinct is to always be hypervigilant, to always be really attuned to everything, absolutely every noise, every move, and actually just get into a place where you can sit with yourself and actually be comfortable with that. I think just is a place where you just wish you could bottle it and give it to people, because if people could go on that journey and get to where we're at, it's a whole new way of looking at life. And I think that's when you get to a point where you see things differently. So I truly believe I now see things differently to most people, and it's through that lens of growth, being attuned to your thoughts, to your feelings, to your emotions, to your behaviors, and being able to control that. For so many people who are affected by sibling sexual abuse, complex PTSD, like you lose control within that. It's one of the first things, I suppose, is your control. So to be able to take that back and be in a place where you've got a faith in yourself. So I don't have a faith, but I do have a true belief in my own ability and my resilience, my ability to actually know that it doesn't matter what you throw at me, I will stand up, and I will keep on, and I'll keep going. And I call it my warrior status, where you grow beyond being just a survivor. You go beyond being a victim and a survivor to actually being a warrior, because that's just, for me, that's to go from being broken and being vulnerable to being strong and empowered and powerful. It's a warrior status. Yeah.
Absolutely, it totally is. And it's that knowledge that even though you also recognize throughout life you will endure forms of trauma or things that cause you great concern and great stress, because you have that underlying faith in yourself, then you'll find your path through, right? I use the differentiator on that one is the difference between having confidence and having self-confidence. I'm a professional speaker and stuff, so I'm fairly confident on stage. But there are times that if the audience is really big, my confidence might shake a little bit, my knees might shake, my eyeballs might shake or whatever. So in that moment, I lack confidence, but I have the self-confidence to know that no matter what, I will find my way through. And many years ago, I didn't have that. I didn't have that kind of self-confidence like you call warrior and I say self-confidence, but it's the same sort of thing as I'll find my way through. And that's, I think, because we sort of did the work. We were willing to accept that we might have to deal with some things in our head. We might have to do certain, have certain kinds of conversations with ourselves that included forgiving of self and all of these sorts of things. We might have to change our boundaries with people, which can be very uncomfortable sometimes. There's all these different things that we do, but I think we get to a point in our journey of healing that it's like, I am worthy of this warrior. I am worthy of this level of self-confidence. So I'm going to do what's necessary. And you mentioned a word that I want to touch on now, because it's another word we use often, and that's that idea of being resilient. So one of the things people often think that resilience and post-traumatic growth are the same thing, and they're not really. They are interrelated, but they're not the same. And in this context, resilience is something that you tend to have before the trauma or before a significant event. So your degree of resilience is kind of reflected in how did that trauma impact you. Usually, not always, this is in general terms, but usually people who are highly resilient are able to make sense of or find meaning in trauma or something that they've experienced quicker than others. They're able to make sense of it. They're able to, that doesn't mean that all, that it's not, doesn't impact them. It's just that they can make sense of it faster. But usually people who are resilient are a little bit older. They've had a number of events occur to them, different types of events, different things that they had to deal with. And so a child, when we're talking about sibling sexual abuse, most children, even children in dysfunctional households, what, quote unquote dysfunctional, have still not developed a full skill set of resilience that one could say, or they're on the path because they're dealing with high levels of stress or anxiety in the home already. So they have been exposed to things that are causing a great deal of stress. But usually children are not overly resilient. So, I mean, that's a sweeping statement, but I think you know what I mean when it comes to this sort of situation. If you're abused or assaulted by a sibling at the age of 6, for example, you haven't got a lot of resilience skills built up in the same sort of way. But interestingly, in the research, what ends up happening for a lot of people is, and again, this is a broad brush general statement, but those who were not resilient before a traumatic event have more opportunity for growth afterwards, right? Which includes building more resilient skills for future trauma events. But what that means then is, as someone who probably didn't have a lot of resilience prior to the sibling sexual abuse that one endures, you have a whole world of growth available to you if that's the choice that you make. Because you didn't have it before the trauma and somehow it got a little stuck when the trauma, and then of course what we know in sibling sexual abuse, trauma is often repeated. And then it's all the ancillary trauma of having to sit there while you listen to how wonderful your brother is or your sister or family events and all of these sorts of things, and you're re-traumatized. You kind of get stuck. And the only reason why I'm saying all of this is because I want to emphasize that the possibility of growth exists in a kind of a big way for people who endured trauma as children, because the initial skills weren't there. So now they can build them and build them huge if they want. That big warrior thing is available because you didn't have it beforehand. So it's still available to you now, sort of thing. That's why I'm emphasizing that. But of course, post-traumatic growth also means that you do become more resilient to the future traumas that one has in one's life, such as the sort of death of a spouse or a parent or something like that. So one is more resilient. Anyway, over to you on the concept of resilience, because I know you like this one too.
Yeah, so I think for me, survivors are some of the most resilient people you meet. And it is because there's often multiple experiences, and it's layered and it's layered and it's layered. And every time you experience something, you start to build that resilience within. You start to find a way to almost steel yourself towards some of it. But when you go through that process of post-traumatic growth and you've built that resilience in that stage, you're right, the impact of heading into situations that perhaps before growth would have been re-traumatizing and triggering, and it would have took you back into a space of vulnerability. I think that post-traumatic growth piece, coupled with that resilience, that increased level of resilience every time you go through something, when it comes to actually engaging in family events, for example, funerals, or especially when we're looking at sibling sexual abuse, the ability to step into that as an adult, where you've got your power back and you've got that level of resilience, then maybe you can step into that space where perhaps you wouldn't have before. So where somebody might be at this moment in time completely locked off from their family because that's just what they needed at that moment in time. That ability to put that distance between members of the family was the start of the building of the resilience and the building of protecting oneself in it, I think. So being able to go through that process, go through the post-traumatic, because I think they do link whilst they're not the same, they do link. And the more you grow, the more resilient you become, not just through negative experience, but now through positive reinforcement as well.
Absolutely.
So that level of resilience is completely different to what you were even 10 months ago or 12 months ago, because of the sort of continuing situation. So as an adult, when you step back into that family space, which for some people might be the first time that they've did that since the grenade went off in the family, stepping into these situations, having gone through a therapeutic process, followed a pathway, and then went through your own process of post-traumatic growth, where you now hold your own power and you've built those levels of resilience, you're going to be more capable and more resilient to stepping into some of these spaces. So I don't think it's important to separate them out, but I think it's impossible to talk about one without talking about the other.
They are definitely linked, but it's people sort of think that, well, if I'm resilient, then I can handle everything. And that's yes, but not as a child. Like it's not resilience is sort of a skill that you build. We're born with levels of resilience, obviously, but it's a skill that you build as you endure life events, natural life events, not abusive life events, but natural life events. And you sort of build this skill up. But when you're introduced to a trauma very young, you haven't got that skill in place. And And then, so that's why it can be so that can be one of the reasons why it can be a contributing factor to why the impacts are so significant, because there was little resilience there. And then also, though, if we hold on to the story of what happened to us, if we hold on for it, we'll stay there. One needs to decide to step on a path of growing, to step on that path of self-reliance and self-compassion and self-awareness and all of these sorts of things to make that possible. Because what I see in a lot of the Facebook groups and stuff that I'm in is people are, and I'm not saying this in any sort of judgmental way, but people are stuck. And I just want to reach into those Facebook groups and turn someone around a little bit and say, go down this path. And this path is much brighter, but it will take some work on your part. You can't sort of sit back and do nothing and hope to get post-traumatic growth. Like, you have to work it. Like you do. You have to, whether it's you're in therapy or appropriate self-help type things, and you have to work it. I would always recommend therapy, but that's not always available to people. So there's all sorts of really good stuff out there, things on cognitive behavior therapy and the workbooks and stuff that can help somebody on that path to see what they're thinking and to challenge that thinking, for example, like shoulds or try and all that, by the way, which is why I have Yoda sitting right there. We do or do not, there is no try. There are tools out there, but we're sort of impressing upon people the notion that the tool helps you to build something, and what you can build is this personal power. This growth comes. It requires the work, but the growth comes. And it also, you were alluding to stepping back from the family environment. I'm all for that if what that does is give somebody space to do some of that work. If they simply step back and they don't do the work, well, not a lot's going to happen. It's still going to be traumatic stepping back into the family fold, as it were. But if you step back and you learn how to have boundaries with the family, you don't have to show up to every Thanksgiving meal, and you don't have to do this, that, and the other thing. I mean, I made decisions early on about how I was going to deal with my brothers and stuff like that, because my parents had passed away. But, I made some decisions about the boundaries that I was going to have. Were they against societal norms as how I should, quote unquote, deal with my family? You betcha they were. They were, but they were what I needed to do. So to separate myself out, I was in one of the groups, and this just sort of popped into my head. I was in one of the groups, and there was somebody there who is a survivor of SSA, wondering if she should invite her brother to the wedding, and I was sitting there going, no, absolutely not. I told my brother not to come. And I knew the risks doing that, and I haven't spoken to him since, and that was 17 years ago. And it's like, bye-bye, like, it's fine, so way outside of societal norms. But that's because I've gotten to a place where that's absolutely okay, and I'm number one.
Right. And I think that's the key bit. And our whole conversation here is that post-traumatic growth piece is about putting you above everything else and looking inwards. And your resilience is like your body armor that goes around you. So this is about you. Is so often when we look at trauma, we're talking about all the other things that happened. Post-traumatic growth's about you as an individual, and that's you're right, as a choice, Nancy. People need to want to go through they need to want to go to the lighthouse. They need to want to go visit that and to actually be able to feel that. Otherwise it won't work, because it's not an easy, we've made it sound dead easy. It is not an easy process, when you're looking inward and you're looking at the bits of you that you perhaps don't like, or the bits that don't sit right. And there is a process that you need to go through with that. And I am at the point where I wholeheartedly embrace every part of me, because that is what makes me who I am. And I think when you can truly get to that point where you are putting yourself first, and whether that is in the early stages of disclosure and family finding out, where you actually need to say, for my benefit, I'm stepping away from this, right down to establishing what that new relationship might look like and what the parameters are around that. You know, restorative, it just brings me back to this whole restorative piece. When I first stepped in to the restorative justice world, I always wondered, at what point would I step into a process? So I had never discussed this because I didn't want to sway somebody's view one way or another. But it took almost 3 years and 2 family funerals for me to recognise that I had initially went from, I'll go through restorative justice for this person, this person, this person, because that would do this, this, and this. And I was at the very, very bottom of the list. So therefore, I decided at that point, this isn't something for me. However, as time has went on and that level of resilience has sort of deepened, I am now at a point where actually I would step into a restorative process. It would be for my benefit, and it would be to discuss what the new parameters and the new boundaries were in and around the family makeup and how we would interact. I haven't taken it any further because I now know that that's what I need from a situation. So there's that post-traumatic growth, the resilience, the restorative justice piece. Do you know, they all tie together and put a person at the heart of it. And I just think this conversation's been truly enlightening. But when we actually start to put ourselves first, you really start to see your life transform in and around it. And I think that, especially when we look at the complexities of sibling sexual abuse, we are always thinking about this person and that person. And if we say this, or if we do this, then this may... Actually, what about you as an individual and as a person? What about you? What do you need from? So yeah, I'll stop, Nancy, because I could go.
Well, we could go on, but I just really respect your viewpoint. And you know, I think that, you know, for me, one of the messages I try and get out into the world is that message of hope, is that, okay, identify as somebody who has survived sibling sexual abuse, for example, or even caused the harm, you know, whatever. And those who have caused harm and are remorseful and have, you know, guilt and stuff like that, they deserve a path of, there's post-traumatic growth in that too, and we've seen it in some of the research and stuff, but we're predominantly talking about survivors on this particular call. And I think that idea of positioning oneself in the center of one's life, you know, and as you were talking also about your path with restorative justice and all that sort of stuff, you know, when you get to a point where you do things not because you should, but because you choose to, then you're really on that path of that warrior path, right? No, I choose to do this. There's no should, there's no societal should, there's no family should, there's no even should in old learned tape behavior in the back of my head kind of should, you know, like it's just, I choose to do this. And no matter what, I will come out the other side absolutely fine. Thank you very much. You know, and that is that demonstration of personal power and growth on the understanding. I mean, I consider myself to be somebody who's grown a lot in my life and over the years and stuff like that. But there's no doubt I can have really shitty days and get set back. So, but we go back to that notion of I will sit there feeling sorry for myself, swan diving into Haagen-Dazs and, you know, maybe a gin and tonic. But tomorrow I'll be fine. Thank you very much. Like it's that back. I will find my way through this. Right now, I'm in a crappy mood. I'm in a bad place, but I will find my way through. And I think for me, years ago, I was missing the second half of that sentence. It was just, I was in the moment of this is shit. This is just shit where I am right now. And I couldn't see beyond where I was. And that held me back for a long, long time until I started doing this self-reflection and raising my self-awareness and having compassion for some of the things I had to accept about myself.
100%.
And forgive myself for, or just say, yeah, that's the way it was, or whatever. And needed to move forward from that. I wouldn't have gotten here without that, I don't think.
Mhm.
And like you, I found meaning too. I mean, I've been working in this domain in one form or another for a really long time, but you know, when you find that meaning, the SiblingsToo project, the Awareness Day, and the other things that I'm doing are not only sort of the finding meaning for me, but they're a reflection of where I am in my growth. Like you said about you, they're a reflection of where you are in your growth, that we want to turn around and help others find their path.
Yeah, I think if we can share some of that, Nancy, then, you know, if we could bottle it up, the world would be a better place. And unfortunately, we cannot bottle it. So
I know.
we need to do it. We just need to share that. And that is how we'll create change. And it is what people will listen to. And I hope that if there's people who've been listening to this today, they feel hopeful and optimistic, and they actually choose to reach out and to speak to someone, because that's the first step. And then once you go through that process, anything's possible at the other end.
And absolutely anything's possible. We're going to wrap up now. Is there anything that is left unsaid? Is there something that you want to share that you've not had a chance to share?
I don't think so, Nancy. I think I just said it there. You know, if you're listening, find hope in this conversation and find a way to speak to someone so as you are not alone, because that's how it feels sometimes. So yeah, there's people out there that can support.
Thank you very much for that, Ashley. And I just want to remind everybody that Ashley Scotland is from Thriving Survivors in Scotland. And you can check out her work on the website. So thank you very much for your time today, Ashley. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Nancy.